In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where centuries-old traditions bind the monarchy to its people's hearts, a single moment would shatter everything the royal family believed about duty, love, and sacrifice. When Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella stood before the golden gates of Ravenspire Palace that cold December morning, their eyes red with unshed tears, and their hands trembling as they clutched a letter that would change their lives forever, nobody could have predicted that this would be the day the strongest royal couple in Europe would face their greatest test. The letter, sealed with black wax and bearing the royal physician's urgent signature, contained words that would echo through the marble halls of the palace like a death knell. As snowflakes began to fall on the ancient cobblestones, covering the kingdom in a blanket of white that seemed to mirror the numbness spreading through their hearts, Alexander and Isabella knew that the fairy tale the world believed in was about to crumble. What happens when those who are meant to be the pillars of strength for an entire nation discover that their own foundation is built on sand? How do you say goodbye to everything you've ever known, when millions of people are watching your every move, waiting for you to be the beacon of hope they've always needed you to be? This is not just a story about royalty. This is a story about two people who must choose between their crown and their hearts, between duty and desire, between the roles they were born to play and the life they desperately want to live. In a world where every tear is photographed, every embrace is analyzed, and every decision affects the fate of a kingdom, Alexander and Isabella are about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of courage is knowing when to let go. The palace may be wrapped in grief, but within its walls burns a love story so powerful, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that it will redefine what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to choose love over legacy. The morning mist clung to the towers of Ravenspire Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the ancient stones that had witnessed 1,000 years of royal triumphs and tragedies. Crown Prince Alexander stood at the window of his private study, his reflection wavering in the frost-covered glass as he watched the sun struggle to break through the December clouds. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had been drilled into him since childhood. But today something was different. Today, the weight of the crown felt heavier than ever before. The knock at his door came precisely at 7 o'clock, as it had every morning for the past 8 years. Princess Isabella entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned not through royal protocol, but through the deep love that had grown between them since their arranged marriage had blossomed into something neither had dared to hope for. She carried a silver tray bearing 2 cups of tea and a single white envelope that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Isabella set the tray down on the mahogany desk that had belonged to Alexander's great-grandfather, King Magnus the Bold, and studied her husband's face. After 8 years of marriage, she could read his moods like musical notes on a staff, and today she heard only discord. His dark hair, usually perfectly styled for public appearances, was disheveled from running his fingers through it. His blue eyes, the same shade as the Valdorian royal standard, held a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. The physician's report came this morning, Isabella said quietly, her voice carrying the slight accent of her homeland, the neighboring kingdom of Lemuria, where she had been born a princess in her own right before becoming the future queen of Valdoria. Her auburn hair caught the weak morning light as she moved closer to him, her emerald-colored dress rustling softly against the Persian carpet. Alexander turned from the window, his face a carefully constructed mask of composure that had taken years to perfect. But Isabella saw through it immediately, as she always did. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his shoulders held themselves just a fraction too straight, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he reached for the envelope. Dr. Pemberton requested a private audience, Isabella continued, settling into the leather chair beside his desk. He'll be here within the hour. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if the words inside carried the weight of destiny itself. Alexander had been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since the dizzy spells had started, ever since the headaches had become too frequent to ignore, ever since Isabella had found him collapsed in the palace gardens after what should have been a routine morning ride. He had initially dismissed her concerns with the stoic determination that had been bred into him through generations of royal blood. Kings did not show weakness. Crown princes did not falter under pressure. The heir to the throne of Valdoria did not crumble in the face of adversity. But, as the symptoms had worsened, as the secret medical tests had been conducted in the privacy of the royal medical wing, Alexander had been forced to confront the possibility that some battles could not be won through sheer force of will. Isabella watched him struggle with the envelope, her heart breaking a little more with each passing second. She had fallen in love with Alexander not because of his title or his position, but because of the man beneath the crown. The way he laughed at her terrible jokes when they thought no one was watching. The way he held her hand during state dinners when protocol demanded they remain formal. The way he read bedtime stories to the children at the royal orphanage with voices for every character, bringing magic to lives that had known too little of it. "Whatever it says," she whispered, reaching across the space between them to cover his free hand with hers. "We'll face it together, just as we've faced everything else." Alexander's composure cracked slightly at her words, revealing the vulnerable man behind the royal facade. "The kingdom needs stability, Isabella. The people need to believe in the continuity of the crown. If this news is what I suspect it might be. The kingdom needs honesty," Isabella interrupted gently, but firmly. "The people fell in love with us because we showed them that royalty could be real, that we could be both regal and human. They don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be true." The weight of their responsibilities pressed down upon them both like a physical thing. Valdoria was a small, but influential kingdom, strategically positioned between the major powers of Europe. For centuries, the stability of the monarchy had been the cornerstone of the nation's prosperity. Trade agreements, diplomatic relationships, and internal harmony all depended on the people's faith in their royal family. Alexander and Isabella had worked tirelessly to modernize the monarchy while respecting its traditions. They had opened the palace to public tours, established scholarship programs for underprivileged students, and used their platform to advocate for environmental protection and social justice. Their love story had captured the imagination of not just their own people, but the entire world. Magazines featured them on covers, documentarians followed their charitable work, and young couples across the globe looked to them as an example of what true partnership could accomplish. But beneath the fairy tale exterior, they were still just two people trying to navigate the impossible balance between public duty and private happiness. The pressure was relentless and unforgiving. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every word was analyzed, every gesture was interpreted as having deeper political meaning. They had learned to find moments of genuine connection in the spaces between obligations, stealing kisses in palace corridors, and sharing quiet conversations in the royal gardens when the world wasn't watching. As Alexander finally opened the envelope with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor, Isabella felt time slow to a crawl. The morning light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across the study and illuminating the portraits of previous monarchs that lined the walls. Kings and queens who had ruled through wars and plagues, through prosperity and poverty, through personal triumph and devastating loss. All of them watching silently as their descendant prepared to confront his own moment of truth. The letter was written in Dr. Pemberton's careful handwriting, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that his diagnosis would ripple far beyond the confines of medical necessity. Alexander's eyes moved across the page slowly, absorbing each clinical phrase, each careful explanation, each devastating conclusion. Isabella watched her husband's face transform as he read, seeing the exact moment when hope gave way to acceptance, when the future they had planned together shifted into something unknown and uncertain. When he finally looked up from the letter, his eyes held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "How long?" she asked quietly, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. 6 months, Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "Maybe less. The tumor is inoperable, positioned in a way that makes any surgical intervention impossible. Dr. Pemberton wants to discuss treatment options that might extend that timeline." But the words hung in the air between them like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. 6 months to say goodbye to everything they had built together. 6 months to prepare a kingdom for the unthinkable. 6 months to figure out how to live with the knowledge that their love story would have an ending written by fate rather than choice. Isabella rose from her chair and moved to stand behind Alexander, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and pressing her cheek against his hair. They stayed like that for several minutes, drawing strength from each other's presence, allowing themselves this moment of private grief before they would have to put on their public faces and pretend that the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. "We'll tell the children first," Isabella said finally, thinking of their 8-year-old daughter Victoria and their 6-year-old son James, who were probably at this very moment having breakfast in the nursery, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. "Not yet," Alexander replied, turning in his chair to face her. "Let's wait until after we've spoken with Dr. Pemberton, until we understand all of our options. They deserve to know, but they also deserve hope." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation, followed by a discreet knock. Their private secretary's voice came through the door, announcing the arrival of Dr. Pemberton and the beginning of what would be the longest day of their lives. As Isabella straightened Alexander's tie and smoothed his hair with the tender familiarity of years of marriage, she made a silent promise to herself and to the man she loved. Whatever the next 6 months brought, whatever challenges they would face, whatever impossible decisions lay ahead, she would not let him face any of it alone. Alexander stood and squared his shoulders, transforming once again into the crown prince that his people needed him to be. But as he walked toward the door to admit Dr. Pemberton, Isabella saw him pause and look back at the window where he had been standing when she first entered. The mist had finally lifted, and weak winter sunlight was beginning to paint the palace grounds in shades of gold and amber. "It's going to be a beautiful day," he said softly, and Isabella understood that he was talking about more than just the weather. The door opened, and Dr. Pemberton entered with the weight of medical certainty and royal protocol balanced carefully on his shoulders. A distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands, he had served the royal family for over 20 years, delivering 3 royal babies and treating everything from childhood scraped knees to state dinner food poisoning with equal dedication and discretion. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, bowing slightly before accepting their invitation to sit. "I'm afraid the test results confirm our worst fears, but I want you to know that we have options to explore, treatments that might give us more time, and certainly ways to ensure that whatever time we have is lived with dignity and purpose." And so began the conversation that would reshape everything they thought they knew about love, duty, and the courage required to face an uncertain future with grace. As the morning sun continued its slow climb across the Valdorian sky, 3 people sat in a palace study and planned for the impossible, finding hope in the darkest of circumstances and strength in the bonds of human connection that transcended even the ancient power of the crown. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of the royal chapel, painting rainbow patterns across the stone floor where Alexander and Isabella knelt in silent prayer. 3 hours had passed since their meeting with Dr. Pemberton, 3 hours since their world had been irrevocably altered, and yet the palace around them continued its ancient rhythm as if nothing had changed. Isabella's fingers worried the pearls of her grandmother's rosary, each bead worn smooth by generations of royal women who had sought comfort and faith during their darkest hours. Beside her, Alexander's hands were folded in perfect stillness, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man preparing for battle against an enemy he couldn't see or touch or defeat through force of will. The chapel had always been their sanctuary within the palace, a place where they could shed the weight of their titles and simply be 2 people seeking guidance from something greater than themselves. They had been married here 8 years ago, surrounded by foreign dignitaries and heads of state. But Isabella remembered most clearly the moment when Alexander had lifted her veil and whispered that he loved her, not Princess Isabella of Lemuria, but simply Isabella, the woman who made him laugh and challenged his opinions and shared his dreams for their kingdom's future. They had brought their children here for christening, had come here together during the difficult early years of their marriage when the pressure of public scrutiny and royal duty had threatened to overwhelm their still fragile love. It was here that Alexander had confessed his fears about becoming king, and here that Isabella had revealed her struggles with the constant criticism from the press and the impossible standards expected of a modern princess. Now they sat in the same wooden pew where they had weathered so many storms together, facing the greatest challenge of their lives with the same united front that had seen them through everything else. But today felt different. Today, the silence between them hummed with unspoken fears and desperate hopes, with all the things they wanted to say but didn't know how to voice. "Do you remember our wedding day?" Isabella asked quietly, her voice echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. Alexander turned to look at her, noting how the colored light from the windows caught in her auburn hair, making it glow like burnished copper. "I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. An arranged marriage that turned into a love story seemed too good to be true." You were so nervous during the ceremony. Isabella smiled, the memory bringing a moment of warmth to the cold reality of their current situation. Your hands were shaking when you put the ring on my finger. I wasn't nervous about marrying you, Alexander corrected gently. I was nervous about being worthy of you, about being the kind of husband and king you deserved. Isabella reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. You've been both. You've been everything I could have hoped for and more than I ever dared to dream. The weight of that admission settled between them, made heavier by the knowledge that their time together was now measured in months rather than the decades they had always assumed stretched ahead of them. They had planned to rule together, to see their children grow up and marry and have children of their own, to grow old together in the palace that had become their home. The children will be finishing their afternoon lessons soon, Alexander said, glancing toward the chapel's ancient clock. We should tell them before someone else does. Palace secrets have a way of traveling faster than royal proclamations. Isabella nodded, though the thought of explaining death and loss to 8-year-old Victoria and 6-year-old James made her stomach clench with dread. How do you tell children that their father is dying? How do you explain that sometimes even princes can't fight off the dragons that threaten their kingdom? They rose together, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor as they made their way through the chapel's ornate doors and into the corridor beyond. The palace felt different now, as if the very walls had absorbed the gravity of their situation. Portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch them with new intensity, and the grandfather clock in the main hall counted off seconds that suddenly felt precious rather than routine. The royal nursery occupied an entire wing of the palace's third floor, transformed over the years from the austere study halls of previous generations into bright, cheerful rooms filled with books and toys and the comfortable chaos of childhood. They found Victoria and James exactly where they expected to, in the large playroom where afternoon light streamed through tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Victoria, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, was sprawled on the Persian carpet with her homework spread around her like fallen leaves. She had inherited Alexander's methodical approach to learning and Isabella's stubborn independence, creating a combination that both delighted and occasionally exasperated her tutors. At 8, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and compassion that would serve her well in her future role as heir to the throne. James sat at a small table nearby, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on a watercolor painting of the palace's famous rose garden. Where Victoria was serious and studious, James was all energy and enthusiasm, approaching every task with the boundless optimism of a child who believed the world was full of infinite possibilities. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's blue eyes, and a smile that could charm even the most serious of royal advisors. Both children looked up as their parents entered, and Isabella felt her heart constrict at their innocent joy. Victoria scrambled to her feet and ran to embrace them, followed closely by James, who launched himself into Alexander's arms with the complete trust of a child who had never known his father to be anything but strong and invincible. "Mama, Papa," James exclaimed, paint still wet on his fingers. "Look what I painted. It's our garden, but I made the roses purple because I think they would be prettier that way." Alexander held his son close, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood that clung to his hair, memorizing the weight of his small body and the sound of his laughter. "It's beautiful, James. Purple roses are definitely an improvement on the original design." Victoria, more observant than her younger brother, studied her parents' faces with the careful attention that had always made her seem older than her years. "Is everything all right? You both look sad." Isabella and Alexander exchanged a glance, communicating volumes in that single look. They had discussed how to handle this moment during their walk from the chapel, but no amount of preparation could make this conversation easier. "Come sit with us," Isabella said, settling onto the large sofa that dominated one corner of the playroom. "We need to talk to you about something important." The children arranged themselves on either side of their parents, Victoria curling against Isabella's side while James climbed into Alexander's lap, his painting forgotten on the table. The afternoon light seemed to dim slightly, as if the sun itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. "You know that Papa hasn't been feeling well lately," Isabella began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The doctors have been trying to figure out what's wrong, and today we got some news." Victoria's grip on her mother's hand tightened, while James looked back and forth between his parents with growing concern. At 6, he didn't fully understand the concept of serious illness, but he could sense the change in the room's atmosphere, the way the air seemed to have grown thicker and more difficult to breathe. Alexander cleared his throat softly. The doctors found something in my head called a tumor. It's making me sick, and they can't make it go away. But doctors can fix everything, James said with the absolute certainty of a child who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by the adults in his life. They have medicines and machines and magic. Not this time, little prince, Alexander said gently, using the pet name that had belonged to James since birth. Sometimes even the best doctors and the strongest medicine can't fix what's broken. Victoria's face had gone very pale, and Isabella could see her daughter's quick mind working through the implications of what they were telling her. As the heir to the throne, Victoria had already begun her formal education in royal history and protocol. She knew about the kings and queens who had died young, about the children who had inherited crowns before they were ready, about the weight of responsibility that sometimes fell on shoulders too small to bear it. "Are you going to die?" Victoria asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Alexander felt his composure waver, but Isabella's steadying presence beside him gave him the strength to continue. "Yes," he said simply. "The doctors think I have about 6 months." James's face crumpled as the words penetrated his understanding, and he buried his face against his father's chest with a sob that seemed too large for his small body. Victoria remained silent, but tears began to roll down her cheeks in steady streams. Isabella gathered them all into her arms, creating a circle of warmth and love in the midst of their shared grief. "I know this is scary," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "I know it doesn't seem fair or right, but we're going to get through this together as a family." "Will you have to go away?" James asked, his voice muffled against Alexander's shirt. "Not yet," Alexander replied, stroking his son's hair. "I'm going to be here for as long as I can. And even when my body isn't here anymore, the love I have for you and Mama and Victoria will always be here, in your hearts." They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, talking through tears and silence about what the coming months would bring. Alexander and Isabella explained how the kingdom would continue, how Victoria would one day be ready to be queen, how their family's love would be strong enough to carry them through even this impossible loss. As the palace around them prepared for the evening meal and the routines that structured royal life, the family at its heart clung to each other and began the long process of learning how to say goodbye. Outside the nursery windows, the gardens that James had painted in impossible colors were touched with the golden light of sunset, beautiful and fleeting and precious precisely because they would not last forever. When the children were finally asleep, exhausted by emotion and comforted by promises that their parents would stay close, Alexander and Isabella found themselves alone in their private sitting room, facing the magnitude of what lay ahead. "Tomorrow we'll have to tell the Prime Minister," Isabella said, curled against Alexander's side on their favorite sofa. "And the cabinet, and the Archbishop, and eventually the people." "The people," Alexander repeated, thinking of the millions of citizens who looked to him for leadership and stability. "How do we tell an entire kingdom that their future has changed? How do we prepare them for what's coming?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, listening to the steady rhythm of her husband's heartbeat beneath her cheek. "We tell them the truth," she said finally. "We show them that even in the face of loss, love endures. We teach them that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how you choose to stand back up." As midnight approached and the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, they remained awake, talking through plans and fears and hopes, holding each other against the darkness that threatened to overwhelm them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and the beginning of a journey neither of them had wanted to take. But tonight, they had this moment, this perfect stillness, this love that death itself could not diminish. And, in the end, they both understood, perhaps that was enough to build a legacy on. The state dining room at Ravenspire Palace had hosted kings and emperors, prime ministers and presidents, but never had its ornate walls witnessed a conversation quite like the one taking place on this gray March morning. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hartwell sat across from Alexander and Isabella, her usually composed features showing the strain of processing information that would reshape the very foundation of Valdorian governance. 3 months had passed since Dr. Pemberton's devastating diagnosis, 3 months during which the royal couple had navigated the treacherous waters of state secrecy while watching Alexander's condition slowly but steadily decline. The headaches had worsened, the dizzy spells had become more frequent, and the subtle changes in his speech and coordination had become impossible for Isabella to ignore, even as she marveled at his determination to maintain his public duties. "Your Majesty," Prime Minister Hartwell said carefully, her hands folded in her lap as she struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "I need to ensure I understand the full scope of what you're telling me. The physicians believe you have, at most, 3 months remaining." Alexander nodded with the calm dignity that had characterized his entire approach to his illness. Dr. Pemberton's most recent assessment suggests that the tumor's growth has accelerated beyond their initial projections. We felt it was time to begin the formal transition process. The formal transition process. The words carried such weight, such finality, that Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat despite having rehearsed this conversation countless times. 3 months to transform their 8-year-old daughter from a child who painted pictures and chased butterflies in the palace gardens into the heir apparent who would one day rule a kingdom. Prime Minister Hartwell, a woman who had navigated political crises with the skill of a master diplomat, found herself at a loss for words. She had served under 3 monarchs during her 40-year career in government, had weathered economic recessions and international incidents, but nothing had prepared her for this moment when she realized she was about to watch a man she both respected and genuinely liked prepare to die. "The constitutional requirements for a regency," she began, her voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "will need to be implemented immediately. Princess Isabella will need to be formally appointed as regent for Princess Victoria until she reaches her majority." Isabella straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of crown and scepter settling on her shoulders even though they remained safely locked away in the palace treasury. "I understand the responsibilities that entails, Alexander, and I have been reviewing the legal precedents and constitutional provisions. There will need to be a formal announcement," the Prime Minister continued, her political instincts taking over as she began to process the practical implications of their conversation. "The people will need time to prepare, to understand what this means for the kingdom's future. How much do you want to reveal about His Majesty's condition?" This was the question that had kept Alexander awake for weeks, staring at the ceiling while Isabella slept fitfully beside him. How much truth could a kingdom bear? How much detail about his illness would serve the public good versus merely satisfying morbid curiosity? "We want to be honest," Alexander said slowly. "The people deserve to know that their king is human, that even royal blood can't protect against life's cruelest realities. But we also want to emphasize continuity, stability, hope for the future." Through the tall windows of the dining room, they could see the palace gardens where Victoria and James were having their morning lessons with their tutor, Lady Margaret Thornton. Victoria sat primly on a stone bench, her governess pointing out various botanical specimens, while James chased a butterfly with the boundless energy that had characterized his entire 6 years of life. Isabella followed her husband's gaze and felt her heart constrict with the familiar mixture of love and terror that had become her constant companion. In a few short months, that serious little girl with Alexander's thoughtful eyes and her own stubborn chin would be Queen Victoria of Valdoria, the youngest monarch in the kingdom's history. The responsibility felt crushing, even filtered through the knowledge that Isabella would serve as regent until Victoria came of age. "The international implications will be significant," Prime Minister Hartwell said gently. "Our trade agreements, our diplomatic relationships, our position within the European Union, all of these will be scrutinized as the world tries to determine what kind of monarch Princess Victoria will become." "She'll be a great queen," Alexander said with the quiet certainty of a father who had watched his daughter demonstrate wisdom and compassion far beyond her years. "But she needs time to be a child first. That's what the regency will provide." The conversation continued for another hour, covering legal requirements and ceremonial protocols, public announcements, and private preparations. But beneath the formal discussions about constitutional law and governmental procedure lay the human reality of a family preparing to lose its cornerstone, a kingdom preparing to say goodbye to a beloved king. As Prime Minister Hartwell gathered her documents and prepared to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at the royal couple who had transformed the monarchy during their relatively brief reign. Alexander and Isabella had brought a warmth and accessibility to the crown that had endeared them to people across the political spectrum. Their commitment to environmental causes and social justice had made Valdoria a leader among small European nations, while their obvious love for each other and their children had provided a fairy tale narrative that had captured imaginations worldwide. "Your Majesties," she said softly, "I want you to know that it has been the greatest honor of my career to serve under your reign. The kingdom is stronger, more compassionate, and more unified because of your leadership." After she left, Alexander and Isabella sat in the dining room's ornate silence, processing the magnitude of what they had just set in motion. The formal machinery of royal transition would now begin its ancient dance, with proclamations and ceremonies and legal documents that would ensure the smooth transfer of power from one generation to the next. But they were not ready to face the public demands that would soon descend upon them. Instead, they walked through the palace corridors toward the gardens, drawn by the sound of their children's laughter and the need to hold on to normalcy for just a little longer. They found Victoria and James exactly where they had expected to, but the lesson had ended, and both children were now engaged in an elaborate game of hide and seek among the topiary animals that had been carved by royal gardeners over the past century. Victoria's giggles echoed off the garden walls as she crouched behind a hedge shaped like a lion, while James searched for her with the determined focus of a miniature detective. "Found you," James cried triumphantly as he spotted the edge of Victoria's blue dress peeking out from behind the topiary. "Now it's your turn to find me." Alexander and Isabella watched their children play, memorizing every detail of this perfect, ordinary moment before their lives would be forever changed by the weight of royal duty and public scrutiny. Soon, Victoria would no longer have time for hide and seek in the gardens. Soon, every moment of her life would be scheduled and supervised and analyzed by people who saw her not as a little girl who loved butterflies and fairy tales, but as a symbol of national continuity and royal tradition. "Should we tell them now?" Isabella asked quietly, thinking of the announcement that would be made to the nation in just a few days. "About the regency, about what's going to happen?" Alexander shook his head, watching as James squeezed himself behind a topiary rabbit that was clearly too small to conceal his giggling form. "Let them have this afternoon. Let them be children for a few more hours." As the day progressed, the palace around them buzzed with quiet activity as staff members who had been briefed on the situation began preparing for the changes that were coming. Royal secretaries drafted press releases, security personnel reviewed protocols for protecting a child queen, and household staff made subtle adjustments to accommodate the increased attention that would soon focus on Victoria. Dr. Pemberton made his daily visit, conducting his examination with the gentle thoroughness that had made him such a trusted member of the royal medical team. The news was neither better nor worse than expected, the tumor continuing its relentless growth while Alexander's body fought a battle it could not win. "The important thing, Dr. Pemberton said as he packed his medical bag, is that you're still strong enough to make the choices that matter. You still have time to say the things that need to be said, to create the memories that will last long after you're gone." That evening, as the palace settled into its nighttime routine, Alexander and Isabella tucked their children into bed with the extra tenderness that had become their habit since learning about the diagnosis. Victoria, already showing signs of the perceptiveness that would serve her well as a queen, sensed the undercurrent of sadness in her parents' demeanor, but asked no questions. James, exhausted by his day of play, fell asleep before his bedtime story was finished, his small hand clutched around a toy knight that had been Alexander's own childhood favorite. Standing in the doorway of their son's room, watching the gentle rise and fall of his breathing in the soft glow of the night light, Alexander and Isabella felt the full weight of what they were about to lose. Not just their time together as a family, but the chance to see their children grow up, to guide them through the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood, to be present for all the milestones and celebrations and quiet moments that make up a life. "I keep thinking about all the things I won't be here to see," Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Victoria's first state dinner as queen, James starting university, their weddings, their children. Isabella took his hand, intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become their anchor through every storm. "Then, we'll make sure every day we have left counts for 10. We'll love them so completely, so thoroughly, that they'll carry that feeling with them for the rest of their lives." As they made their way to their own bedroom, past portraits of monarchs who had faced their own trials and triumphs, Alexander and Isabella began planning for the announcement that would change everything. In 3 days, they would stand before the people of Valdoria and explained that their fairy tale romance was about to become a story of courage in the face of unthinkable loss. But tonight, they had each other, and the quiet sound of their children sleeping safely down the hall, and the knowledge that love, once given completely and unconditionally, becomes immortal in ways that even death cannot diminish. The crown might be a burden, but the love that held their family together was a strength that no illness could ever take away. The throne room of Ravenspire Palace had never felt so vast as it did on the morning of the royal announcement. Sunlight streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the marble floor where television cameras and broadcasting equipment created a modern intrusion into the medieval grandeur. Representatives from news organizations across Europe and beyond had gathered to witness what palace officials had described only as a matter of critical importance to the kingdom. Alexander stood before the massive mirror in his private dressing room, his reflection showing a man who bore little resemblance to the vibrant prince who had captured hearts 8 years earlier. The tumor's effects were becoming increasingly visible despite his determination to maintain his public composure. His face had grown thinner, his eyes held a weariness that couldn't be hidden by royal training, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the ceremonial medals that adorned his formal uniform. Isabella entered quietly, her own reflection joining his in the mirror as she came to stand behind him. She wore the emerald green dress that had become her signature color, the one that brought out her eyes and reminded Alexander of the Irish countryside where they had honeymooned in those blissful early days of their marriage. Her auburn hair was arranged in the elegant chignon that royal protocol demanded for formal occasions, but her face showed the strain of the past months, the weight of supporting a dying husband while preparing to rule a kingdom. The children? Alexander asked, though he knew Isabella had already ensured Victoria and James were safely occupied with their tutors, shielded from the media attention that would soon descend upon the palace like a hurricane. Lady Margaret is keeping them busy with extra lessons in the East Wing, Isabella replied, her hands gentle as she straightened his collar. Victoria knows something important is happening, but James thinks it's just another boring grown-up meeting. They stood together in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence as they had learned to do during the most difficult moments of their reign. In just a few minutes, they would walk down the palace's grand staircase and through the corridors lined with portraits of their predecessors, making their way to the throne room where they would change the course of Valdorian history with a few carefully chosen words. The announcement itself had been crafted through weeks of collaboration between royal speechwriters, constitutional lawyers, and medical advisors, each word weighed for its potential impact on everything from stock markets to international relations. But beneath the formal language and diplomatic phrasing lay a simple, heartbreaking truth. A young father and husband was dying, and a kingdom was about to lose the king who had brought it into the modern era. "Are you ready?" Isabella asked softly, though she knew the question was meaningless. No one could ever be ready for this moment, this crossing of a threshold from which there would be no return. Alexander turned from the mirror and took her hands in his, feeling the familiar comfort of her wedding ring against his palm. "I keep thinking about our first public appearance together," he said, remembering the nervous young woman who had stood beside him 8 years ago, struggling to find her place in the complex hierarchy of royal life. "You were so afraid of saying the wrong thing, of making a mistake that would embarrass the crown." "I'm still afraid," Isabella admitted. "But now I'm afraid of saying goodbye." The walk to the throne room felt both endless and far too brief, their footsteps echoing through corridors that had witnessed 1,000 years of royal triumphs and tragedies. Palace staff lined their route, bowing silently as they passed, many with tears in their eyes as they faced the reality of serving a monarchy in transition. The throne room doors opened with ceremonial grandeur, revealing an audience that included not only journalists and camera operators, but also the highest-ranking members of Valdorian society. Prime Minister Hartwell stood with the cabinet ministers, while Archbishop Morrison represented the religious establishment that had blessed and supported the monarchy for centuries. Foreign ambassadors occupied their designated section, prepared to transmit news of this announcement to capitals across the globe. Alexander and Isabella took their places on the twin thrones that had been carved from Valdorian oak 3 centuries earlier, their elevated position allowing them to survey the assembled crowd while maintaining the dignity that royal protocol demanded. The familiar weight of the ceremonial crown felt heavier than usual on Alexander's head, its ancient gold and precious stones a reminder of all the monarchs who had worn it before him, and all who would wear it after. Citizens of Valdoria, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the room's acoustic perfection. It is with both sadness and determination that Princess Isabella and I come before you today to share news that will affect not only our family, but our entire kingdom. The room fell into absolute silence, the only sound the soft whir of television cameras recording every word for posterity. Alexander's training in public speaking, refined through years of addresses to Parliament and speeches at state functions, served him well as he maintained perfect composure despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Several months ago, I began experiencing health issues that led to extensive medical examination. Today, I must inform you that I am suffering from an inoperable brain tumor that will, according to the finest medical minds available to us, claim my life within the coming months. The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through the assembled crowd in the form of audible gasps, muffled sobs, and the barely controlled emotions of people who had not expected to confront their own mortality through their monarch's announcement. Isabella felt her composure waver as she watched the faces below transform with shock and grief. But Alexander's steady presence beside her provided the anchor she needed to continue playing her part in this carefully orchestrated revelation. However, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. This news, while devastating to our family, does not threaten the stability or continuity of our beloved kingdom. In accordance with constitutional law and royal tradition, Princess Isabella will serve as regent for our daughter, Princess Victoria, until she reaches her majority and can assume the full responsibilities of the crown. The constitutional implications of his words were not lost on the audience, many of whom were already calculating the political and economic ramifications of a regency government. But for those who knew the royal family personally, who had watched Victoria grow from a toddler into a thoughtful, intelligent child, the announcement carried a more personal weight. An 8-year-old girl was about to become queen, and the woman who had captured the kingdom's heart through her grace and compassion was about to bear the burden of ruling in her daughter's name. Princess Victoria, Alexander said, his voice softening with paternal pride, has been raised with full understanding of the responsibilities that await her. While she is still a child who deserves the chance to learn and grow, she possesses the intelligence, compassion, and strength of character that will serve our kingdom well in the years to come. As he spoke, Alexander's thoughts drifted to the little girl who was probably at this very moment practicing her penmanship in the palace schoolroom, unaware that her childhood was about to be measured in months rather than years. Victoria would need to learn statecraft and diplomacy, constitutional law and international relations, all while grieving the loss of her father and adjusting to the overwhelming responsibility of wearing a crown that had been worn by warriors and scholars, saints, and tyrants. The transition process will begin immediately, Isabella said, taking over the announcement with the smooth professionalism that had made her such an effective royal partner. I will assume the duties of regent while continuing to support His Majesty in his royal functions for as long as his health permits. Our commitment to the causes we have championed together, our dedication to Valdoria's prosperity and the welfare of its people, remains unchanged. The questions from the assembled journalists were both respectful and probing, reflecting the delicate balance between public interest and royal privacy that had always characterized coverage of the Valdorian monarchy. How much detail could be revealed about Alexander's condition? What provisions had been made for Victoria's education and preparation for queenship? How would the Regency government handle ongoing diplomatic negotiations and domestic policy initiatives? Alexander and Isabella answered with the careful honesty they had practiced, providing enough information to satisfy legitimate public concern while protecting their children's privacy and maintaining the dignity of the crown. But beneath their composed responses lay the raw emotion of parents trying to shield their children from the harsh realities of public scrutiny while preparing them for lives that would never again be entirely their own. When the formal announcement concluded and the media representatives began filing out of the throne room, Alexander and Isabella remained on their thrones for several minutes, watching the space empty of everyone except their closest advisors and most trusted staff members. The afternoon sun had shifted, changing the pattern of colored light that fell across the marble floor, creating new shadows and highlights that seemed to symbolize the transformation their kingdom had just undergone. It's done, Isabella said quietly, her words carrying both relief and trepidation. The secret they had carried for months was now public knowledge, subject to analysis and speculation by everyone from political commentators to ordinary citizens discussing the news over dinner. Prime Minister Hartwell approached the throne, her expression reflecting the complex mixture of personal sorrow and professional obligation that would characterize much of the coming transition period. Your Majesties, the initial media response has been respectful and supportive. The public appears to be rallying around the royal family rather than questioning the stability of the monarchy. Alexander nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for the people who had supported him and Isabella throughout their reign. Valdoria was a small kingdom with a strong sense of national identity, and its citizens had always taken pride in their royal family's accessibility and dedication to public service. As evening approached and the palace settled into its new rhythm of heightened security and increased staff attention, Alexander and Isabella finally returned to their private apartments where Victoria and James waited with their governess. Both children had been kept busy throughout the day, but Victoria's sharp intelligence had picked up on the unusual activity around the palace. "Papa," she said as soon as they entered the sitting room, "Lady Margaret says there were lots of important people here today. Was it about your sickness?" Alexander knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in his, and looking into eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 8 years. "Yes, sweetheart. We told the kingdom about my illness so they could prepare for the changes that are coming." "What kind of changes?" James asked, abandoning his toy soldiers to join his family. Isabella gathered both children close, her heart breaking as she prepared to explain how their lives would be forever altered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Victoria is going to become queen when Papa goes to heaven," she said gently. "And Mama is going to help her learn how to do that job until she's old enough to do it by herself." The weight of that responsibility settled over Victoria's young shoulders like an invisible cloak, and Alexander watched his daughter's expression change as she began to understand the magnitude of what awaited her. But alongside the fear and uncertainty, he saw something else, the same determination and grace that had made Isabella such a remarkable princess, the same strength of character that had sustained the Valdorian royal family through centuries of challenge and change. As they sat together in their private sitting room, watching the palace gardens fade into twilight, Alexander and Isabella began the most important work of their reign, preparing their children not just to survive the coming storm, but to emerge from it stronger and more compassionate than ever before. The announcement had been made, the kingdom had been told the truth, and now the real work of saying goodbye could begin. The early morning mist hung over Ravenspire Palace like a benediction, softer and more gentle than it had been on that December day 6 months earlier when Dr. Pemberton had first delivered his devastating diagnosis. Alexander stood at the same window in his private study, but now he needed Isabella's arm for support, and the reflection that wavered in the frost-covered glass showed a man who had made peace with his mortality. May had brought an unexpected gift of time. Dr. Pemberton's initial prognosis had proven conservative, and while Alexander's condition continued its relentless progression, he had been granted precious additional weeks to complete the work of preparing his kingdom and his family for the future they would face without him. The tumor's effects were increasingly visible now, his left hand showing a persistent tremor and his speech occasionally slurring when fatigue overtook his determination, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbroken. The kingdom had rallied around their dying king with a devotion that had surprised even Alexander's most optimistic advisors. Letters of support arrived daily from across Valdoria and beyond, children's drawings depicting the royal family as superheroes, flowers left at palace gates by citizens who wanted to express their love in the only way available to them. The announcement of his illness, rather than destabilizing the monarchy, had somehow made it more human, more accessible, more beloved than ever before. Victoria, now 9 years old and bearing the title of Queen-in-Waiting with a dignity that amazed everyone who met her, had thrown herself into her royal education with an intensity that both impressed and worried her parents. She spent her mornings with constitutional tutors, learning about parliamentary procedure and international law, and her afternoons with language instructors, perfecting the French and German that would be essential for her future diplomatic responsibilities. But it was in the quiet moments between lessons that Victoria revealed the depth of her understanding about what was happening to their family. She had begun leaving little notes under Alexander's pillow, drawings of the two of them together with messages written in her careful cursive. I will be a good queen because you taught me how. I love you to the moon and back and to heaven too. I will take care of Mama and James forever and always. James, at 7, approached his father's illness with the forthright acceptance that characterized childhood's relationship with incomprehensible realities. He had appointed himself Alexander's special assistant, bringing him glasses of water when the medication made his mouth dry, reading aloud from adventure books when headaches made it difficult for Alexander to focus on text, and maintaining a steady stream of cheerful chatter about his lessons and his friends and the elaborate fantasy games that occupied his imagination. Papa, James had announced just the week before, when you go to heaven, will you tell God that we're doing okay down here? Because I think he might worry about us. Isabella had found her own rhythm in the strange new world of preparing for widowhood, while simultaneously preparing to rule a kingdom as regent. The constitutional lawyers had been thorough in their preparations, ensuring that every legal requirement for the transition of power had been met, every protocol had been established, every contingency had been planned for. But no amount of legal preparation could have readied her for the emotional reality of watching the man she loved fade away by degrees, even as she fell in love with him more deeply each day. Their evening conversations had become precious rituals, moments when they could set aside the weight of royal obligation and simply be Alexander and Isabella, husband and wife, sharing their fears and hopes and memories. They talked about their children's futures, about the kind of Queen Victoria would become, about the man James would grow into. They reminisced about their own courtship and early marriage, laughing over the diplomatic incidents they had accidentally caused and the protocol mistakes that had horrified palace staff. Do you remember our first Christmas together? Isabella asked one evening as they sat in their private sitting room, Alexander's head resting against her shoulder while she stroked his hair. You were so nervous about giving me that necklace. It was my grandmother's, Alexander murmured, his voice soft with fatigue and medication. I was terrified you'd think it was too presumptuous, that I was moving too fast. I cried when I opened it, Isabella remembered. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because you trusted me with something that meant so much to your family. I knew then that I wanted to trust you with everything, Alexander said. My heart, my kingdom, my children's futures. I've never regretted that decision. The conversations with foreign dignitaries and heads of state had been more challenging, requiring careful diplomacy to reassure international partners that Valdoria would remain a stable and reliable ally despite the dramatic changes in its leadership structure. Isabella had proven herself to be a natural diplomat, her genuine warmth and obvious intelligence winning over even the most skeptical observers. The Archbishop had been particularly helpful during this transition period, providing not only spiritual guidance for the royal family, but also serving as an intermediary between the palace and the people during the difficult process of national grief. His weekly sermons had begun to prepare the kingdom for the reality of Alexander's death, while celebrating the legacy he would leave behind. A king's true immortality, Archbishop Morrison had said in one particularly moving address, lies not in the length of his reign but in the depth of his love for his people and the strength of the foundations he builds for those who will come after him. Dr. Pemberton's daily visits had evolved from medical examinations focused on treatment to compassionate conversations about comfort and dignity. The tumor had grown beyond all hope of intervention, but Alexander's pain was well managed, and his lucid moments remained frequent enough for him to participate in the ceremonies and decisions that would mark his final weeks as king. The important thing now, Dr. Pemberton had explained to Isabella during one of their private consultations, is that he has time to say goodbye properly. Time to complete the emotional work of preparing his family and his kingdom for his departure. The most difficult conversation had been the one about funeral arrangements, a discussion that required balancing royal tradition with personal wishes, constitutional requirements with family grief. Alexander had been clear about his desires for a ceremony that would celebrate his life and reign while looking forward to the future rather than dwelling on loss. I want the children to remember it as a celebration, he had told the palace staff charged with planning the state funeral. Yes, there will be sadness, but I want them to see how a nation comes together to honor someone they loved, how love transcends death and becomes part of the foundation for what comes next. The international guest list for the funeral was already being prepared, with representatives from royal families and governments across the globe planning to attend. But Alexander was most concerned with the Valdorian citizens who would line the funeral route, the people who had supported him throughout his reign, and who deserved the chance to say their own goodbyes. As May progressed into its final weeks, Alexander's moments of clarity became more precious and more rare. But during one particularly lucid afternoon, he asked Isabella to bring the children to his study for what they all understood would be their final formal conversation as a complete family. Victoria entered with the composed dignity that had become her hallmark, her small hand taking her mother's as they approached Alexander's chair by the window. James bounded in with his usual enthusiasm, climbing immediately onto his father's lap despite Isabella's gentle warnings about being careful. "I want you both to listen carefully," Alexander said, his voice weak but clear, "because these are the most important things I will ever tell you." Victoria nodded solemnly while James settled against his father's chest, his small fingers playing with the buttons on Alexander's cardigan. "Victoria, you're going to be a wonderful queen. Not because you're smart, though you are, and not because you're kind, though you are that too. You're going to be wonderful because you understand that being a monarch means serving your people, not ruling over them. Remember that always." "I will, Papa," Victoria whispered, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "And, James," Alexander continued, turning his attention to his son, "you're going to be the best little brother a queen ever had. Your job is to keep Victoria laughing, to remind her that she's not just a queen but also your sister who used to help you catch butterflies in the garden." "I can do that," James said confidently. "I'm very good at making people laugh." "You are indeed," Alexander agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of his son's head. "And both of you need to remember that Mama is the strongest, wisest, most loving person any of us has ever known. When things get difficult, when you're scared or confused or angry, you listen to her. She'll guide you through anything." Isabella felt her composure finally crack, tears flowing freely as she watched her husband say goodbye to their children with a grace that broke her heart even as it filled her with pride. "Will you watch us from heaven?" James asked with the direct simplicity that characterized all his questions about death and loss. "Every single day," Alexander promised. "And I'll be so proud of the amazing people you're going to become." As the afternoon faded into evening, the family remained together in Alexander's study, sharing stories and memories, holding each other against the approaching darkness. Outside the windows, the palace gardens bloomed with late spring flowers, their beauty a reminder that life continues its eternal cycle of death and renewal, loss and growth, endings and new beginnings. That night, as Alexander slept peacefully with Isabella's hand in his, the palace around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the ancient stones themselves understood that they were witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. When morning came, bringing with it the soft light of a perfect May day, Alexander opened his eyes one last time to see Isabella's face above him, beautiful and tear-stained and full of all the love that had sustained them through 8 years of marriage and 6 months of saying goodbye. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but his meaning perfectly clear. "Thank you for choosing me," Isabella whispered back. "Thank you for our children, for our kingdom, for showing me what love really means." "Take care of them," Alexander said, his eyes moving toward the door beyond which Victoria and James were probably just waking up, unaware that this would be the day their lives changed forever. "I will," Isabella promised. "We'll take care of each other, and we'll make you proud." As Alexander closed his eyes for the final time, Isabella felt his hand grow still in hers, felt the moment when his gentle breathing simply stopped, felt the precise instant when the king of Valdoria became a memory and a legacy rather than a living man. The palace bells began to toll an hour later, their solemn bronze voices carrying the news across the kingdom and around the world. King Alexander was dead. Long live Queen Victoria. But in the royal apartments of Ravenspire Palace, a widow gathered her children close and began the long, difficult, beautiful work of teaching them that love, once given completely and unconditionally, never truly dies. It simply transforms into something stronger than grief, more enduring than loss, more powerful than even the ancient magic of the crown itself. The fairy tale was ending, but the love story would continue forever.